Welcome to the debate. Imagine an impenetrable fortress.
Okay.
Its greatest defense isn't, offensive weaponry. It's actually just the power of the occupants to simply ignore an attacker.
Right.
So, today, we're asking a pretty vital question about network governance. When the BIP 110 upgrade failed completely, did it prove that individual node runners are fundamentally powerless against giant mining monopolies?
Or does it prove that the network's governance architecture successfully defends individual sovereignty, like exactly as it was designed to do?
Exactly. And we're framing this entirely through the lens of that recent BIP 110 failure, and we're going to contrast it directly with the historical success of the 2017 SegWit upgrade.
Right, specifically the user-activated soft fork, or BIP 148.
Yeah, BIP 148. So I am taking the position that the system is, well, it's working flawlessly. Power in this architecture is deliberately asymmetric. The individual user holds ultimate authority, but that authority manifests exclusively through the absolute defensive veto of local node validation and economic self-custody.
Mm-hmm.
You basically cannot force changes on others, but nobody can force changes on you.
And my position is that this theoretical defensive veto is, practically speaking, it's insufficient against the gravitational pull of centralized capital and, massive mining pools.
Okay, but
True individual empowerment in the decentralized network is an illusion without active structural mitigations at the protocol layer. Because saying no isn't really enough if saying no just, removes you from the economic reality entirely. A perfectly secure, empty room isn't much of a fortress.
I see where you're going with that. But let's unpack the failure of BIP 110, because I think it highlights exactly why this defensive architecture is so critical. A full node derives its strength from enforcing validation rules, right?
Right, rejecting invalid blocks.
Exactly, rejecting invalid blocks. So if we look back at 2017, the user-activated soft fork for SegWit, that succeeded because it was a mechanically necessary, value-additive upgrade.
It fixed a real problem.
Yeah, before SegWit, we had this major flaw called transaction malleability.
Which was a nightmare.
Total nightmare. Bad actors could essentially alter transactions ID before it was confirmed in a block.
Right.
And that made chaining unconfirmed transactions extremely dangerous, which, completely blocked the development of Layer 2 scaling solutions.
Like the Lightning Network.
Like the Lightning Network, yeah. So SegWit fixed that mechanism. And most importantly, it enjoyed a unified economic consensus among major exchanges, wallet providers, and custodians.
Right. It had the capital backing.
Exactly. The market demanded it. Now, you contrast that with BIP 110.
Which was a very different situation.
Completely different. This was an attempt by an ideological minority to use that exact same UASF mechanism to force restrictive transaction filtering. They wanted to filter out arbitrary data pushes to stop chain bloat.
Yeah.
But because BIP 110 used this really blunt size restriction, it inadvertently risked breaking complex Taproot and Miniscript smart contracts.
Right, because those contracts intrinsically rely on larger data payloads to execute, complex multi-signature conditions.
Precisely. So it lacked capital backing because it broke existing utility. Therefore, the governance design correctly prioritized unanimity over, minority node counting games. Individuals maintained absolute sovereignty over their own local state.
Because they didn't have to accept the data pushes if they didn't want to.
Right, but they completely failed to force the broader market to adopt a new restriction.
Okay, but you're viewing this entirely through the lens of a failed attack.
I think it was.
Well, look at the systemic reality it revealed. You call it a defensive veto, but validation rules that are disconnected from economic consensus, they don't result in sovereignty. They result in self-isolation.
How so?
Just look at the actual data from the BIP 100 activation attempt. When the mandatory signaling window opened.
You mean the specific block height?
Yeah, the specific block height where miners were required to digitally vote in their block headers to enforce the new rules. What actually happened?
They ignored it.
They completely ignored it. The enforcing chain produced exactly 2 blocks before stalling completely.
Right.
Miner signaling peaked at roughly but 2.5%, and that was entirely concentrated in a single mining pool.
Yeah, it was very small.
Meanwhile, the main chain retained essentially 100% of the network's hash rate. So saying no to the network is totally meaningless if you simply strand yourself on a dead chain with zero liquidity.
But
Consequently, individual node count is just a facade for power. Real influence is hyper-centralized in economic nodes and mining pool operators.
But that isolation is exactly the point. The enforcing nodes isolated themselves because they attempted an offensive maneuver they had no right to win.
No right to win?
Let's look at a game theory of why the miners behaved that way. You're arguing the nodes had no power. I'm arguing the system correctly repelled an attack.
They attempted a maneuver that revealed their structural powerlessness. I mean, in game theoretic terms, BIP 110 was a non-credible bluff.
A bluff.
Yeah, because the movement had zero major exchange commitment. They had no market pricing. Custodians and intermediaries were completely absent.
Right.
Therefore, miners had a dominant financial incentive to completely ignore the soft fork and continue mining the lucrative main chain, which, contained full fee markets.
Because of the electricity costs.
Exactly. Think about the physical mechanics of mining. Miners direct hash power toward the chain that offers the highest economic return.
Always.
Right. So mining non-compliant blocks on the BIP 110 chain meant burning massive amounts of physical electricity to produce unspendable coins that no major exchange would accept or price. This proves that nodes without capital backing are structurally powerless to direct the network.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. That isn't powerlessness. It is Sybil resistance at work.
Sybil resistance?
Yes, it is an intentional, foundational defense mechanism. Look, if simple node counts dictated consensus, if a minority of nodes could just declare a new rule and force the miners in the market to follow, then the entire system would collapse overnight.
Well, sure, a pure node count.
Because running a full node costs just a few dollars a month. IP addresses are cheap. They're virtually infinite. If a raw node count was how we determine network upgrades, anyone with a massive cloud computing budget could launch a Sybil attack.
Right.
A hostile nation-state or a wealthy corporation could spin up, 100,000 virtual nodes on Amazon Web Services to rewrite the protocol rules in an afternoon.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So the failure of BIP 110 proves the system is immune to those Sybil attacks. A node runner can refuse to accept invalid transactions and reject invalid blocks forever. If a cartel of miners tries to force an inflation bug on you, your node will reject it. You won't follow their chain, like a fire door.
A fire door?
Yeah, it doesn't dictate where the building's occupants must walk, which would be offensive coercion, but it absolutely prevents a fire from spreading into your room.
I will certainly acknowledge the flaw in an I-based node democracy. IP democracy is easily gained via botnets and server spamming.
Exactly.
And the alternatives in other networks aren't much better. Proof of stake essentially creates a plutocracy, handing protocol control permanently to early insiders and massive exchanges.
It's terrible.
And proof of personhood requires state IDs or biometric centralization, which destroys user privacy.
Right. So we agree on the defense mechanism.
I concede that tying consensus to cheap validation nodes is dangerous. However, relying on this nebulous concept of economic power as the network's primary defense is deeply flawed because of user passivity.
Wait, economic power isn't nebulous. It represents the aggregate will of the users holding the asset. It's the ultimate skin in the game.
In theory, yes. In practice, collective action against economic nodes suffers from massive friction.
How so?
The vast majority of casual users leave their assets on custodial platforms. They don't self-custody their private keys.
Well, they should.
But they don't. And by doing this, they inadvertently grant centralized intermediaries massive proxy voting power. The exchange executives become the de facto governors of the network because they control the liquidity venues.
I don't think they govern the network.
But they do. So when you say BIP 110 failed because it lacked economic backing, the mechanical reality is that a half dozen CEOs of major custodial exchanges didn't support it, so the miners ignored it. That is a highly centralized bottleneck masquerading as decentralized consensus.
You're fundamentally mischaracterizing the relationship between custodians and users, though.
Am I?
Yes, economic nodes, the exchanges, the executives, they do not hold autonomous power. They only reflect aggregate capital, and their power is a proxy that can be revoked instantaneously.
Instantaneously. That's a stretch.
We have historical proof of this mechanism working. Look at the concept of the liquidity exit. During the 2017 SegWit2x debate, a massive consortium of corporations, miners, and exchanges signed a closed-door agreement to force a hard fork.
Right, the New York Agreement.
Exactly. They had the executives, they had the custodial proxy votes, but active users initiated a mass liquidity exit.
Which requires incredible coordination.
It does, but when it happens, the mechanics are devastating to the custodians. When users explicitly withdraw their funds from custodial platforms to self-custody, it triggers a chain reaction.
Okay.
It stresses the exchange's fractional reserves if they are playing fast and loose. It crushes their daily trading volume. Their fee generation engines stall out entirely.
Sure.
Furthermore, during that 2017 dispute, users pledged to dump the corporate-backed fork token on the futures markets, which utterly destroyed its market pricing before the fork even launched.
Yeah, the market spoke.
Right. So the ultimate power lever is not forcing restrictions through node counts. It is the power of capital flight. Custodians are terrified of a mass withdrawal because it destroys their business model.
I come at it from a different way, though. Even if users coordinate a massive economic exit, they still rely on a specific mechanism to execute that exit.
Meaning what?
How do you withdraw those funds to self-custody? You have to send a transaction.
Who processes that transaction? The miners. If the economic majority wants to exit, but a centralized mining cartel refuses to process the withdrawal transactions, your capital is trapped.
Okay, that's a fair point.
And that brings us to the ultimate vulnerability, how those blocks are actually built. If the users have trouble coordinating economically, the network is fundamentally vulnerable if mining is highly centralized.
So we are shifting to the mechanics of block construction now, specifically the Stratum mining protocols.
Exactly, because under standard Stratum v1, the mining protocol that has dominated the industry for years, pool operators completely monopolize block template construction.
Right.
Under Stratum v1, the mining pool is like a head chef in a restaurant.
Okay.
The head chef writes the menu, buys the ingredients, and plates the food. The individual miners scattered around the world are just the dishwashers.
I like that analogy.
Yeah. The pool's central node selects the transactions, sets the fee thresholds, handles the censorship lists, and sets the soft fork signaling bits.
Right, the signaling bits like we saw with BIP 110.
Exactly. The pool then sends a stripped-down header to thousands of individual miners who just act as dumb hardware, guessing numbers to solve the cryptographic puzzle.
Right.
This means if just 3 pool managers control 65% of the network's hash rate, 3 human beings dictate exactly what transactions get included.
Which is terrifying.
It completely disenfranchises the thousands of actual hardware owners who are backing those pools with physical energy. It is a massive centralization of political power.
I completely agree that Stratum v1 centralizes block construction in a deeply problematic way. The head chef metaphor is spot on.
Thank you.
But let's look at the proposed solutions for democratizing mining, because they often introduce severe structural trade-offs.
Like what?
Well, one approach is hardware democratization. The philosophy seen in networks like Monero. They mandate algorithms that are heavily dependent on standard CPU cache and memory.
The RandomX approach.
Right, trying to keep the barrier to entry extremely low so anyone with a laptop can mine. But the mechanics of that trade-off are brutal. CPU-bound mining creates immense financial incentives for botnets and malware to hijack victim hardware across the globe.
Yeah, because every compromised computer is suddenly a miner.
Exactly. It also yields a much lower total physical energy budget securing the chain, making it cheaper for a nation-state to attack.
Yes, fighting ASIC efficiency is a losing battle. Purpose-built hardware will always outcompete general-purpose hardware. I'm not advocating for CPU mining.
Right, so the alternative is protocol democratization, which brings us to Stratum v2. Rather than fighting ASICs, the protocol decouples hash power creation from block construction.
It lets the miners be the chef.
It allows the individual miner to be the chef, selecting their own transactions. But I have to challenge you on the practical reality of this. Let's talk about the bedroom hobbyist running a microminer. Do these hobbyists actually have the enterprise-grade bandwidth and mempool visibility to assemble highly profitable blocks?
I think they do.
But if a home miner running Stratum v2 misses out on high-fee arbitrage transactions because of internet latency, their block is worth less. Pure economics will eventually force them right back to using the pool operator's optimized template just to stay profitable. Does Stratum v2 actually empower the individual, or is it just a theoretical tool that only sophisticated institutional miners will use?
I'm really glad you brought up the economic viability, because we need to do the math on how the continuous queue actually neutralizes censorship, even if micro miners are operating at a slight latency disadvantage.
Okay, let's hear the math.
The landscape has shifted toward open source, low-power micro ASICs, devices like BitX units.
Right.
These are essentially space heater setups running local full nodes, building their own block templates locally through Stratum v2's job negotiation protocol.
The JNP? Yeah.
Right. To use your earlier metaphor, they are cooking their own distinct recipes, and they only use the pool operator as the cashier at the front of the house to split the daily profits.
But their total hash rate percentage is still a rounding error compared to the multi-megawatt industrial farms in Texas or Iceland.
It doesn't matter if it's a rounding error because of how censorship actually functions in a continuous blockchain. Censorship only works if it is absolute.
I mean, true.
Let's do the exact math on this. Blocks are found every 10 minutes on average.
Yep.
If a state actor captures 95% of the miners and forces them to censor a specific transaction, but independent microminers using Stratum v2 control just 5% of the network hash rate, what happens?
They still find blocks eventually.
By statistical probability, that 5% will find 1 out of every 20 blocks. 20 blocks times a 10-minute average is 200 minutes, or about 3.3 hours.
Wow. Okay.
That means an utterly censored transaction doesn't die. It just waits 3.3 hours to be picked up by that independent 5%.
I can't argue with the statistical math. 3.3 hours is a massive win for censorship resistance. It turns a permanent embargo into a mild inconvenience.
Exactly. To permanently kill a transaction, an attacker must achieve 100% template compliance across every single miner on Earth.
Which is basically impossible.
Right. The job negotiation protocol allows any miner to construct their own uncensored block templates locally, sending them to the pool just for financial clearing and payout smoothing. It strips the pool operator of its proxy vote.
It neutralizes the cartels.
It completely neutralizes cartels. So yes, even if home mining is just 1% or 5% of the network, and even if they miss a few high-fee transactions due to latency, that tiny baseline of uncensorable hash rate utterly destroys the viability of a systemic censorship regime.
That mathematical reality is precisely why the architecture is so resilient. And what you're describing with Stratum v2 actually aligns perfectly with my initial philosophy of individual sovereignty.
It does?
Yeah. By pushing block construction to the absolute edge of the network, allowing a low-power home node to build a template from its own mempool in milliseconds, it structurally neutralizes the threat of cartels.
Oh, absolutely.
And to your earlier point about whether only institutions will use it, industrial farms do actually use this for legal isolation.
Right, for OFAC compliance.
Exactly. If a central pool faces Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC sanctions, an institutional farm running Stratum v2 can build its own clean templates, avoiding sanction contagion while still getting pooled payouts. This proves that decentralizing transaction selection protects the network at literally every scale, from the bedroom hobbyist to the publicly traded mining facility.
It solves the variance problem, the need for predictable, smoothed payouts, without forcing miners to delegate their political power to a middleman.
It is a profound structural defense, which brings us back full circle to the failure of BIP 110.
Right.
As we summarize our positions, I look at all these complex mechanisms we've discussed. The aggregate force of the economic liquidity exit, the continuous queue of independent mempools ensuring censorship is mathematically impossible, the game theory of miners burning energy on invalid chains, and I reiterate my stance.
Which is that the system worked.
Exactly. The failure of BIP 110 was not a symptom of individual powerlessness, it was a triumph of extreme conservatism and multi-stakeholder consensus. The system requires near unanimity for restrictive changes.
Okay.
The individual user's power was never meant to be the ability to force new restrictions on the rest of the world. That is offensive coercion. The user's power is the absolute right to reject coercion through local node validation and economic self-custody. You enforce the rules you agreed to, and the system structurally protects your ability to do so, regardless of what centralized entities attempt.
And as I summarize my position, I will concede that this defensive power exists, and that the math of the continuous queue is incredibly powerful.
It's hard to argue with the math.
It is, but I maintain that this defense requires immense, sometimes unrealistic friction for the average user to exercise through purely economic means alone. Relying on casual users to orchestrate a mass liquidity exit and stall out exchange fee engines every time a threat emerges is a fragile security model.
It's definitely high friction, I'll give you that.
Therefore, true individual empowerment cannot rely on passive node running or theoretical economic threats. It necessitates active, structural tools baked into the protocol like Stratum v2 and the proliferation of distributed micro-hardware.
To strip that proxy power.
Exactly, to continuously, systematically strip proxy voting power from centralized pool operators and custodians. Power isn't just about saying no, it's about possessing the architectural leverage to ensure your no has systemic weight in the actual construction of the ledger.
I think reflecting on these distinct perspectives provides a much richer picture of decentralized governance than we typically see. Understanding both the game-theoretic economic realities, the capital flight and the Schelling points, and the hard architectural mining constraints shows us just how complex this balance of power truly is.
It's a fascinating balance.
We will leave the listener to draw their own conclusions on where the true center of gravity lies in this network. But I keep coming back to that architectural blueprint. Whether you view the fire doors as the ultimate guarantee of your safety, or whether you believe the structural integrity requires active, continuous maintenance of the hallways themselves.
Yeah.
You have to admit, it's a building unlike anything we've ever constructed before. Until next time,